The late afternoon sun was still high enough to cast long, stretching shadows across the asphalt, the kind of golden light that usually makes people feel at ease. But for Second Lieutenant Nazario, driving down the winding two-lane road, there was no ease, only confusion. The hum of the engine was the only sound keeping him company as he navigated his way home. He was tired, the kind of deep bone weariness that comes after a long shift. He was still wearing his uniform, the crisp fabric of his army combat uniform itching slightly against his skin. A constant reminder of the duty he had just finished, and the duty that never really ended. He was driving a new vehicle. A Chevy Tahoe that still had that distinct new car smell and temporary paper tags taped to the rear window. He hadn't even had time to get permanent plates yet. He was driving carefully, paying attention to the road, checking his mirrors, doing everything exactly right. Or so he thought. It started with the flashing lights. A glance in the rearview mirror showed the burst of blue and red. It wasn't the soft glow of a patrol car cruising by. It was the aggressive strobing pulse that meant pull over. Nazario's heart gave a little jump, a natural reflex to seeing authority in action. He immediately lifted his foot off the accelerator and checked his speed. He was doing the limit. He checked his blinkers. They were off. He checked his seatbelt. It was fastened. Why was he being stopped? He looked for a shoulder, but the road was narrow. The grass on the side was high and unkempt, and the drop-off was steep. It didn't look safe, not just unsafe for the car, but unsafe for him. Stopping on a dark, unlit road with a police officer behind you is a situation that makes anyone nervous. But he knew the statistics. He knew the stories. He decided that he wouldn't stop right there in the dark. He would wait. He would drive slowly, carefully, until he found a well-lit public space. A gas station, a parking lot, somewhere with lights and cameras and people. Somewhere safe, he put on his turn signal to show he acknowledged them. He slowed down even more, crawling along at a snail's pace to show he wasn't running. The police car stayed behind him, the lights painting the inside of his SUV in a chaotic disco of red and blue. Another mile passed, then another. For Nazario, those miles felt like hours. His mind started racing. What had he done? Was the tint on the windows too dark? Was it the paper tags? He had just bought the car. Surely that wasn't a crime. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. He kept repeating to himself, asterisk, stay calm. Follow protocol. You are a soldier. You are an officer. You know how to handle this? Asterisk, but this wasn't a battlefield. This was a back road in Virginia, and the rules were different here. Up ahead, finally, he saw the glow of artificial light. A BP gas station. It was an oasis of safety in the gathering darkness. The lot was brightly lit, paved and open. He breathed a small sigh of relief. He could explain himself here. He could show his license and registration here where everyone could see. He turned his blinker and smoothly steered the Tahoe into the lot. Pulling into a parking spot near the pumps, he expected the officer to walk up to the window. He expected a conversation. He expected to be asked for his paperwork. He did not expect what happened next. As soon as the SUV rolled to a stop, the police cruiser didn't park behind it politely. It blocked him in. Two officers stepped out. They didn't walk casually. They moved with aggression. Nazario watched in the rearview mirror, his breath catching in his throat. One officer drew his gun immediately. The other hand was on a taser. Fear, cold and sharp, spiked in Nazario's chest. This wasn't a traffic stop. This was a tactical takedown. He wanted to put his hands up. But he also didn't want to make any sudden movements that could be misinterpreted. He wanted to roll down the window, but he needed to keep his hands visible. He was trapped in a box of his own making, trying to follow invisible rules that seemed to change by the second. Through the glass, he could hear them shouting. But they weren't shouting license and registration. They were shouting commands that didn't make sense. Turn the car off. One screamed, "Keep your hands where I can see them." The other yelled almost simultaneously. Nazario's hands were already on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position. They were the first things anyone could see. He didn't move. He just stared out the windshield, his mind trying to process the disconnect. between the reality of the situation, that he was a uniformed soldier in a new command, the scene playing out in front of him, that he was a dangerous suspect being cornered. The officer with the gun approached the driver's side. He didn't stop at the mirror. He walked right up to the glass, the weapon pointed directly at the driver. The look on the officer's face wasn't one of concern for public safety. It was one of pure, unadulterated rage. His finger was on the trigger guard, hovering dangerously close to firing. Inside the car, the air felt heavy. Nazario's training kicked in. Breathe, assess, survive. He knew that if he reached for the window button, the officer might think he was reaching for a gun. If he moved his hands to turn off the ignition, the same thought might cross the officer's mind. He was frozen, caught in a paralysis of logic versus survival. The officer banged on the window with the barrel of the gun. A terrifying thud that vibrated through the door. "Get out of the car." The officer roared, his face contorted. Nazario couldn't hear him perfectly through the glass, but he could read the lips. He could feel the intent. He shook his head slightly, trying to communicate. He didn't want to get out. He didn't want to escalate. He just wanted to understand why he was being treated like a criminal when he was wearing the uniform of the nation served. The evening breeze picked up, rustling the plastic of the temporary tag in the back window, a small white flag that had led to this moment. The gas station lights hummed overhead, indifferent spectators to the drama unfolding beneath them. Nazario looked at his hands on the wheel, then at the reflection of the gun pointed at his head. In that split second, the road to the gas station didn't feel like a path to safety anymore. It felt like a dead end. The silence inside the SUV was heavy, broken only by the harsh, rapid thumping of his own heart in his ears. Outside, the scene was chaotic. The red and blue lights were still spinning, painting the asphalt in a dizzying strobe that made it hard to focus. The two officers were shouting, but their voices were muffled by the closed glass. Turning their commands into a garbled roar of noise, Nazario kept his hands glued to the steering wheel. At 10 and 2 exactly. It was a muscle memory reflex. He didn't dare move to lower the window. He didn't dare reach to turn off the ignition. He knew that in a situation like this, movement could be mistaken for a threat. He just stared straight ahead, trying to catch the eye of the man with the gun. Trying to find some humanity in the situation, some sign that they could just talk this out. Get out of the car. Now, the scream cut through the glass. Louder this time. One of the officers had moved closer. His face twisted in a way that looked less like an officer of the peace and more like a soldier facing an enemy on the battlefield. He was pointing his firearm directly at Nazario's chest. The muzzle of the gun was huge. It looked like a black tunnel that everything else was disappearing into. Nazario shook his head slowly. He was terrified. His mind was racing a mile a minute. Why was this happening? He was in uniform. He was on a public road. He had done nothing wrong. He wanted to scream, "I am not a threat," but his throat felt tight and dry. Instead, he tried to use his body language to show he was cooperating. He kept his hands perfectly still. "I'm not going to move until you tell me what's going on," he whispered to himself. The sound barely audible, but patience wasn't on the menu that night. The officers didn't see a scared young man trying to follow the rules. They saw someone who wasn't obeying their specific, shouted orders fast enough. They saw a challenge. The shouting match began in earnest, but it was one-sided. Hands out the window. "Show me your hands. Don't make me expletive kill you." The threats were flying fast and loose. Each one hit Nazario like a physical blow. He could feel the adrenaline dumping into his system, making his hands shake slightly. He fought to control the tremor, terrified that the shaking would be seen as a reason to pull the trigger. He took a deep breath, forcing air into his lungs, trying to center himself like he had been trained. Focus. Assess. Don't panic. He decided to try a different approach. Since he couldn't open the door without moving his hands, he couldn't roll down the window without taking a hand off the wheel, he was stuck. He needed them to understand. He needed them to see him. "I'm afraid to move," he finally called out, his voice cracking slightly. He spoke slowly and clearly, hoping they would listen. I'm honestly afraid to get out. Get out. The officer screamed back, stepping even closer to the glass. The gun didn't waver. The other officer was near the back of the car now, shouting contradictory orders. Turn the car off. Let me see your left hand. It was an impossible puzzle. If he reached for the key, he wasn't showing his hands. If he kept showing his hands, the car stayed on. If he opened the door, he was risking his life. If he stayed in the car, they were getting angrier by the second. It felt like a trap designed to make him fail. Nazario looked at the officer with the gun. He really looked at him. He didn't see anger anymore. He saw panic. The officer was hyped up, breathing hard, his eyes wide and darting around. He wasn't in control of his emotions. That was the most dangerous realization of all. A calm officer is predictable. A panicked officer with a gun is a loaded bomb waiting to go off. Please, Nazario said, his voice rising in desperation. I just want to know. Get out of the car. Right now. The officer's finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger itself. It was a subtle shift, but Nazario saw it. His stomach dropped. Time seemed to slow down. He realized that arguing wasn't working. Reasoning wasn't working. The only thing that might save him was to comply, even if it felt like walking into the lion's den. He made a decision. He was going to open the door. He moved his left hand agonizingly slowly toward the door handle. He tracked the officer's eyes, watching to see if the gun would follow. Don't do it, the officer yelled, misinterpreting the movement. Don't you do it? Nazario froze again, his hand hovering inches from the handle. The confusion was absolute. They were screaming at him to get out, but screaming at him not to move. It was psychological warfare. It was designed to break him down, to make him so terrified and confused that he would eventually make a mistake. And then he saw the spray can. The second officer had moved up to the passenger side. The window there was cracked open just an inch. In his hand, he held a can of pepper spray. He wasn't pointing it at the ground. He was aiming it right at the gap in the glass. No, wait, Nazario thought, panic rising in his chest. Not that. The air inside the car suddenly felt very thin. Nazario looked at his phone, sitting on the passenger seat. He had a sudden urge to grab it, to hit record, to make sure that whatever happened next wasn't just his word against theirs. But he knew he couldn't. Moving his hand toward the phone would be suicide. He had to rely on his own voice and his own memory. The standoff continued for another agonizing minute. It was a battle of wills. The officers wanted total submission immediately. Nazario wanted assurance that he wouldn't be shot. They were speaking two different languages. I'm serving this country, Nazario shouted, his voice louder this time, cutting through the noise. I'm serving this country, and this is how I'm treated. It was a plea for brotherhood. He was wearing the same flag they swore to protect in a different uniform, but the same flag. He hoped that mentioning his service would break through the haze of aggression. He hoped it would make them pause. For a split second, it seemed like it might. The officer with the gun faltered, his eyes narrowing as he actually looked at the uniform for the first time, seeing the rank, the name tape. But the moment passed. The aggression had too much momentum. The adrenaline was pumping too hard. I don't care. The officer yelled back. Get out of the car. The second officer with the pepper spray was getting impatient. He didn't care about the uniform. He didn't care about the service. He only cared about compliance. He stepped closer to the window, raising the can. Nazario watched him, knowing what was coming. He closed his eyes for just a second, bracing himself. He knew he had to get out. He knew he couldn't stay in the car anymore. The situation had graduated from a traffic stop to a use-of-force scenario. The window was closing, literally and figuratively. On a peaceful resolution, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He pushed the door open. The cool night air rushed in, but it brought no relief. It only carried the metallic temps of danger. As the door swung open, he kept his hands up high in the air, palms open. He was surrendering. He was giving up his safety, his control, and his dignity, just to try and survive the night. He stepped 1 foot out of the vehicle, waiting for the impact, waiting for the bullets or the spray, wondering how a simple drive home had turned into a fight for his life. The moment his foot touched the pavement of the gas station lot, the atmosphere changed from tense to toxic. It felt like stepping out of a protective bubble and into a war zone. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and the metallic temps of adrenaline. Nazario kept his hands raised high, his palms open and facing outward, a universal sign of surrender that he hoped they would respect. He didn't make any sudden moves. He just stood there, half in, half out of his SUV, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. But the officers weren't looking for surrender. They were looking for dominance, almost immediately. The officer on the passenger side, the one holding the pepper spray, lunged forward. There was no verbal countdown. No last warning. Just a sudden, aggressive spray of orange mist directed right at Nazario's face through the open door. Nazario squeezed his eyes shut, but it wasn't fast enough. The chemicals hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just a sting. It was an immediate, intense burn that soaked into his skin and his eyes. His breath hitched in his throat as the fumes invaded his nose and mouth, choking him. It felt like someone had taken a blowtorch to his face. He gasped, his body recoiling instinctively, pulling back toward the safety of the driver's seat. "Get out. Get out now." They screamed, their voices distorted and demonic through the haze of pain. Nazario's eyes were clamped shut, tears streaming down his face uncontrollably as his body tried to flush out the chemicals. He was blind. He was terrified. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to rub his eyes, to wipe the burning liquid away, but he knew that would only make it worse. He forced his hands to stay up, waving them slightly as if to say, "I'm not fighting. Please stop." He was struggling to breathe. The pepper spray didn't just burn. It swelled the airways, making every breath a battle. He coughed, a deep, rasping cough that shook his entire frame. "I can't see," he sputtered, his voice thick and wet. "I can't see." The officers didn't care. They saw a suspect who wasn't complying fast enough. They grabbed him. He felt rough hands grabbing at his uniform, yanking him out of the vehicle. He stumbled, his legs feeling like jelly. The asphalt was uneven, and he couldn't see where he was stepping. They slammed him against the side of his own Tahoe. The impact knocked the wind out of him, adding a sharp physical pain to the fiery burning in his eyes. He felt his wrist being twisted behind his back, hard. "Too hard? You're under arrest." One of them shouted, twisting his arm up toward his shoulder blades. It felt like it might snap. "What is going on?" Nazario cried out, the confusion mixing with the pain. "Why are you doing this?" "Stop resisting," the officer yelled. "I'm not resisting." Nazario shouted back, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm not resisting." He wasn't fighting. He wasn't trying to get away. He was just trying to breathe. He was trying to survive. But to them, his inability to move because of the pain and blindness was interpreted as resistance. They shoved him to the ground. Nazario fell heavily, his knees hitting the hard pavement. He groaned, disoriented. He was on the ground, hands behind his back, face burning, vision gone. It was the most vulnerable moment of his life. He had served in the army, trained for combat scenarios, but nothing had prepared him for this helplessness. He wasn't fighting an enemy in a foreign land. He was being detained by the people sworn to protect his own neighborhood. Then, through the haze of pain and the sound of his own ragged breathing, he heard a sound that chilled him to the bone, the metallic clack of a gun hammer cocking. He froze. Even with his eyes swollen shut and tears pouring down his cheeks, he knew that sound. It was a sound that meant the next second could be his last. "Don't you do it." One of the officers screamed, his voice right next to Nazario's ear. "I will put you down." Time seemed to stand still. Nazario lay there on the cold, dirty pavement, his face pressed against the tire of his own car. He could feel the heat of the officer's body next to him. He could hear the heavy, aggressive breathing. He realized with a jolt of absolute terror that the gun was pointed at him. He wasn't just being arrested. He was being executed. His mind flashed to his mother. He thought about his career. He thought about the uniform he was wearing, the uniform that was supposed to mean something. "I'm serving this country," he whispered again. But this time the words were so quiet they were almost lost in the wind. Please. I'm serving this country. It was a plea for humanity. It was a reminder that he was a human being, not a target. The officer's grip on his arm tightened painfully. I don't care. The officer yelled back, his voice dripping with contempt. Should have just gotten out of the car. The logic was cruel. He was being punished for trying to be safe. He was being tortured for being cautious. Suddenly, the officer let go of one of his arms. Nazario braced himself, thinking he was about to be struck or worse. But then, he felt the officer's hands grab at his chest. They weren't hitting him. They were ripping things off his uniform. He heard the tearing of Velcro. They were tearing off his patches. One of the officers ripped the American flag patch from his shoulder. It was a symbolic act of violence. It wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was the symbol of the nation he had sworn to defend. Taking it off felt like stripping him of his identity. They were treating him like a common criminal, peeling away his honor as they handcuffed him tightly behind his back. The metal cuffs bit into his wrists. They were ratcheted down so tight that his fingers started to go numb within seconds. He lay there on his stomach, face burning, eyes swollen shut, wrists throbbing, and a heavy weight on his back holding him down. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. How had it come to this? He had done everything right. He had stopped in a safe place. He had kept his hands visible. He had identified himself. And yet, here he was, face down in the dirt. He could hear people nearby. Customers at the gas station had stopped to watch. He heard the distinct sound of a phone camera recording. He felt a small spark of relief. Let them record. Let the world see this. He couldn't open his eyes to see it, but he knew the truth of what was happening was being captured. Get up, the officer grunted. Grabbing him by the arm and hauling him to his feet roughly, Nazario swayed, dizzy and disoriented. The world was a blur of red and black shapes. The burning in his eyes was still intense, a relentless fire that refused to go out. He couldn't wipe it. He couldn't rinse it. He just had to stand there and take it. They sat him down on the curb. It was a small mercy to be off the ground, but the handcuffs were still digging into his skin. He leaned forward, trying to shield his face, trying to find a position where the air would flow a little easier. The officers paced around him, hyped up, talking into their radios, telling a story that wasn't true. They were saying he was evading. They were saying he was resisting. They were building a narrative to justify the violence that had just occurred. Nazario sat there, listening to them lie. He wanted to correct them. He wanted to scream, check the camera, check the logs. But he didn't have the energy. He focused all his remaining energy on one thing, staying calm. He was a soldier. He was trained to endure. He would endure this. He would survive this night. He would make sure that when he finally spoke, the truth would be louder than their lies. Sitting on the cold, hard curb, Nazario felt like he was in a daze. The adrenaline that had kept him sharp during the terrifying encounter was starting to fade, leaving behind a deep, throbbing exhaustion. His face felt like it was on fire, the skin tight and hot from the pepper spray that still coated it. Every blink was a fresh torture, as if someone was grinding sand into his eyes. He kept his eyes squeezed shut most of the time, only opening them to blurry slits when he had to. Trying to protect what little vision he had left, he was handcuffed. His wrists bound so tightly behind his back that his fingers had started to tingle and go numb. The metal cuffs bit into his skin, a constant reminder of his helplessness. He could hear the officers moving around him, the crunch of their boots on the asphalt, the snap-slap of their radios. They sounded breathless, still riding the wave of aggression that had led to this moment. "You should have just listened," one of them muttered nearby. "If you had just gotten out of the car, none of this would have happened." Nazario shook his head slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at the tender skin on his neck. "I was trying to be safe," he said, his voice rough and raspy. "I was driving to a lighted area. I didn't want to get hurt on the side of the road." The officer didn't seem to care about his explanation. To them, this was a simple equation. Command plus obedience equals compliance. Any delay was seen as a threat. But Nazario knew the truth. He knew the danger of being a black man stopped on a dark road. He knew that asking for a safe place to stop wasn't a crime. It was common sense. But common sense had clearly left the building the moment they drew their weapons. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He needed to shift the narrative. He needed to stop being a suspect and start being a person again. And right now, the only way to do that was to use the one thing he had that they couldn't ignore, his uniform. "Look at me," Nazario said, his voice gaining a little strength. He turned his head toward the voices, even though he couldn't see their faces clearly. "Look at my uniform. I am in the military. I am an officer." We're at a pause in their pacing. Maybe they hadn't actually looked at him as a person yet. Maybe they only saw a bad guy in a Tahoe, now that the dust was settling. The reality of his attire was becoming harder to ignore. "I'm Second Lieutenant Nazario," he continued, carefully pronouncing his rank. "I am active duty. I was driving home. I have not done anything wrong." The officer near him scoffed. "Yeah, well, you should have told us that." "I was trying to," Nazario said, frustration leaking into his tone. "I had my hands on the wheel. I was telling you I was afraid. You didn't give me a chance to explain before you pointed a gun at me." He decided to push further. He knew that the military carried weight, even in situations like this. It was a brotherhood, theoretically. He hoped that mentioning his service might trigger some shred of respect or camaraderie. "I have a weapon," he said, deciding total honesty was the only way forward. "I have a concealed carry permit. It is on my right side, in a holster. I am not reaching for it. I am telling you where it is so you can secure it safely." This was a gamble. Admitting to a gun in a high-stress situation could go very wrong, but he knew they would find it eventually when they searched him. It was better for him to tell them, to show he had nothing to hide, than for them to find it and get spooked again. The reaction was immediate. The officers tensed up again. "Where is it?" one barked. "On my right hip," Nazario answered calmly, keeping his hands perfectly still in his lap. "I am not touching it. You can take it." He heard the rustle of gear as they approached him again. He squeezed his eyes shut and held his breath, praying they wouldn't shoot him. He felt hands on his waist, roughly unclipping his holster. They took his service weapon, the one he carried to protect his country, and secured it in their own evidence bag. It felt like a violation, having his tools of duty stripped from him by the very people he served to protect. But once the weapon was gone, the energy shifted. Just a little. The immediate threat of a gun in the car was resolved. Now, there was just a guy in a uniform sitting on the curb. Looking miserable, one of the officers perhaps feeling a twinge of something, maybe guilt. Maybe just the realization that this was turning into a public relations disaster, walked over to Nazario. He stood over him, blocking the harsh glare of the gas station lights. "I'm going to uncuff you so you can rinse your eyes out," the officer said. His tone was less aggressive now, more like a tired mechanic talking about a broken car. "But don't do anything stupid." "I won't," Nazario promised. "I just want the pain to stop." He felt the key turn in the locks. The metal cuff sprang open. The relief on his wrists was instant, though the blood rushing back into his hands hurt almost as much as the cuffs had. He brought his hands around to the front, rubbing his wrists gently, trying to get the feeling back. The officer handed him a bottle of water. "Go ahead. Flush your eyes." Nazario fumbled with the cap. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip it. He finally got it open and tilted his head back, pouring the cool water over his face. It felt like rain on a scorching desert. The water washed away some of the burning chemicals, soothing the inflamed skin around his eyes. He blinked rapidly, letting the water drain down his cheeks and onto his uniform. He poured the second half of the bottle over his head, soaking his hair and the collar of his uniform. He felt like he was washing away the humiliation of the last 20 minutes. He was trying to clean himself up, trying to regain some dignity as he sat there, dripping wet and wiping his face with a sleeve. The reality of the situation settled in. He looked up at the officers. They were standing a few feet away, talking in low voices. They didn't look like heroes. They looked like bullies who had realized the teacher was watching. Nazario realized that the credentials, his rank, his uniform, his service had changed the situation, but not in the way he had hoped. They hadn't made the officers treat him with respect from the start. They had only served as a shield after the damage was done. He was alive, yes, but he had been pepper-sprayed, threatened, handcuffed, and humiliated. His uniform hadn't stopped the violence. It had only made the violence look worse. He knew he couldn't let this slide. He couldn't just get in his car and drive away and pretend this didn't happen. This wasn't right. It wasn't legal. It wasn't how things were supposed to work in the country he fought for. "Can I have my weapon back?" Nazario asked, his voice clearer now that he could breathe again. One of the officers looked at him. Then at the gun in the evidence bag. He hesitated. "No, it's evidence for now." "Evidence of what?" Nazario asked. "Driving with a paper tag." "Being afraid to get out of my car?" The officer didn't answer. He just turned away, obviously uncomfortable with the question. Nazario reached into his pocket for his phone. His hands were still wet and slippery, but he managed to pull it out. He wasn't recording anymore. He didn't need to. The gas station cameras had it all. But he needed to document this moment. He needed to remember how he felt right now. He looked at the screen, his vision still blurry and red. He saw his own face staring back at him, puffy, red, wet, and streaked with dirt. He looked like a victim. He looked like someone who had been in a fight. But behind the tears and the pain, his eyes were hard. He was done being afraid. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a witness. And he was going to make sure that everyone saw what these men had done. Not because he was special, but because he was a human being who deserved better. The credentials had stopped the bullets, but they couldn't fix the injustice. Only the truth could do that. After the water bottle was empty and the stinging in his eyes had dulled to a persistent ache, the officers stood around awkwardly. The adrenaline of the confrontation had evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The gas station lights continued to hum overhead. The only witness to the absurd scene of a uniformed soldier dripping wet on the curb while the police officers tried to figure out how to justify what had just happened. One of the officers shifted his weight, looking at Nazario's uniform again. Maybe it was the wet patches. Or maybe it was the realization that they hadn't found a criminal, but the dynamic had shifted. They weren't barking orders anymore. They were talking quietly, trying to clean up the mess. "We're going to let you go with a warning," one of them said suddenly. His voice lacked the earlier bite. It sounded almost casual, as if they were discussing a broken taillight. "For the traffic violation, you're free to go." Nazario looked up, his vision still blurry and red. "A warning?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You threatened to kill me? You pepper-sprayed me. You ripped my uniform off. And it's just a warning?" The officer didn't answer. He just handed Nazario a crumpled piece of paper, the traffic summons. It was a pathetic gesture, a small scrap of paper trying to cover up a massive violation of trust. Nazario took it, his fingers trembling, not from fear now, but from anger. They didn't give him back his gun, though. They told him he'd have to pick it up from the station later. It was a final petty power move, a way to keep him tethered to them, to remind him that they still held the cards in this twisted game. Nazario slowly stood up. He felt shaky, his knees weak from the chemical shock and the stress. He got back into his Tahoe, the smell of pepper spray still lingering in the upholstery, mixing with the scent of the new car. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the dark road ahead. He was alive, but he felt broken. Not physically, but something deeper. His faith in the system he served had been cracked. He drove away slowly. He didn't go straight home. He knew he couldn't just sleep this off. He needed proof. He needed to show the world what had happened to him, because he knew if it hadn't been recorded, no one would have believed him. A black man, a soldier, assaulted by police over a paper tag? It sounded like a movie script, not real life. He went to an urgent care clinic first. The doctors there documented everything. They photographed his swollen red eyes. They noted the chemical burns on his face. They wrote down the trauma he had suffered. Every note, every photo, was a brick in the wall he was going to build against this injustice. Then came the legal battle. The police department didn't apologize. They circled the wagons. They issued a statement saying their officers had acted appropriately and that Nazario had been non-compliant. They tried to paint him as the problem, as a soldier who thought he was above the law. It was a classic tactic. Attack the victim to protect the abuser. But they forgot one thing. Nazario had told them he was recording, and he had the footage. When the video was released, it didn't just tell a story. It screamed the truth. Millions of people saw it. They saw the guns. They heard the threats. They watched a man in uniform being pepper sprayed while he sat with his hands up. They saw the American flag patch being torn from his shoulder. The public outcry was deafening. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been afraid during a traffic stop. It was about every person who had been treated like a criminal just because of how they looked. The video made it impossible for the department to hide behind their reports. The pressure kept building. It rose like a tide until the powers that be couldn't ignore it anymore. An internal investigation was launched, but this time, the eyes of the country were watching. They couldn't sweep it under the rug. Months later, the news finally came. The driver of the police car, the one who had escalated the situation, was fired. The other officer, the one who had sprayed the chemicals and torn the uniform, was forced to retire. They didn't just lose their jobs. They lost the respect of the community they swore to serve. For Nazario, it was a measure of justice, but it wasn't a celebration. He sued the department for violating his constitutional rights. He argued that no American, regardless of their uniform, should be treated with such cruelty and disregard for human life. The legal fight was long and draining, forcing him to relive the trauma over and over again in courtrooms and depositions. But he stood his ground. He stood his ground just like he had on that roadside. Hands up, refusing to be bullied. He eventually won a settlement. But the money didn't erase the memory of that night. It didn't erase the sight of the gun barrel pointed at his head. It didn't erase the feeling of helplessness when the spray hit his face. However, the outcome did something important. It set a precedent. It told police departments everywhere that behavior like this has consequences. It showed them that the public is watching, and that the badge is not a shield for abuse. Nazario continued his service in the army. He wore his uniform with pride. Maybe even more so than before. He knew now that the uniform represented a set of values: integrity, respect, service that some people in power had forgotten, but that he would uphold. On quiet nights, when he was driving home, sometimes a car would pull up behind him with flashing lights. His heart would still race. His hands would still grip the wheel a little tighter. The trauma leaves a scar that doesn't fade easily. But now he would take a deep breath, check his mirrors, and pull over. He knew who he was. He knew he had the truth on his side. And he knew that, because he spoke up, the road might be a little bit safer for the next person who finds themselves in his shoes. The story of that night wasn't just about a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a harsh lesson, a wake-up call, and ultimately a testament to the power of resilience. It proved that even when you are staring down the barrel of a gun, you don't have to let them take your dignity. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you hold on long enough, the truth really does set you free.